department store. Lights on, doors open. Customers inside right now, buying jeans and towels like nothing happened. Except it did. JCPenney died in a Texas bankruptcy court in May of 2020. What's operating under that name today isn't a recovery. It's a shell. A legal entity called Catalyst Brands, kept standing by the two companies that own the ground it's sitting on. They didn't rescue a retailer. They bought their own tenant. Here's the number that gives it away. $1.75 billion. That's the price tag everyone reported. But almost none of that money bought a retail company. $800 million bought the stores. The rest was something else entirely. To understand why a company's own landlords would buy its corpse and why the math was split that way on purpose, you have to go back to a small store in Wyoming and a rule it was built on. In 1902, a man named James Cash Penney opened a small dry goods store in Kemmerer, Wyoming, and called it the Golden Rule. The idea was almost naive. Treat the customer the way you'd want to be treated, price things fairly, and the business would take care of itself. It worked for the better part of a century. By 1927, JCPenney was trading on the New York Stock Exchange. It expanded into suburbs across the country, and by the 2000s it was running over 1,100 stores, a fixture in almost every American mall. This was never a fringe business. It was a national institution. Then, in 2011, one board made one decision that very nearly ended the company on its own, years before anyone had heard of Simon or Brookfield. JCPenney's board hired Ron Johnson, the executive credited with building Apple's retail stores, and gave him full control to reinvent the company. His pitch: kill the coupons, kill the constant discounting, replace it with clean, fixed, fair and square pricing, no more sales events. It was a bet that JCPenney's customers wanted what Apple's customers wanted. They didn't. Longtime shoppers had built entire routines around clipping coupons and waiting for sales, and when that disappeared overnight, they didn't feel upgraded. They felt abandoned. In a single year, sales collapsed by roughly 25%, a loss of about $4 billion in revenue. The board that hired Johnson fired him after 17 months, but the damage compounded for years afterward. JCPenney logged over $4 billion in cumulative losses between 2011 and 2019, before the pandemic ever laid a hand on it. JCPenney didn't need a pandemic to be dying, it just needed one. In March 2020, COVID shut all 846 stores at once. With no cash coming in, and roughly $5 billion in debt already on the books, JCPenney filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on May 15, 2020. 85,000 jobs hung in the balance. Almost immediately, one bidder emerged as the frontrunner: Sycamore Partners, a private equity firm with a specific reputation. Sycamore had already picked apart 9 West and Aeropostale. Retail workers wrote directly to the bankruptcy judge, warning what a Sycamore win would mean. Sycamore's actual plan: rebrand roughly 250 JCPenney stores under a different retailer it already owned, and liquidate the rest. A plan estimated to cost another 40,000 jobs on top of what had already been lost. This was the standard ending for a company in JCPenney's position. It's not what happened, because JCPenney's landlords had a different kind of math to run. Simon Property Group and Brookfield weren't outside investors circling a distressed asset. They were JCPenney's 2 biggest landlords, the owners of the malls where hundreds of JCPenney stores anchor the building. And an anchor store going dark isn't a small problem for a landlord. It's contagious. When an anchor tenant closes, foot traffic drops for every smaller store around it. The sunglasses kiosk, the food court, the nail salon. Leases get renegotiated downward. The whole property's valuation takes the hit. For Simon and Brookfield, an empty JCPenney wasn't just a lost tenant. It was a wound that would spread to everything next to it. So instead of letting Sycamore liquidate the stores, Simon and Brookfield entered the bidding war themselves in September 2020, not to run a profitable retailer, but to keep the lights on in their own buildings. They won. And this is where the number splits. The deal was reported everywhere as $1.75 billion. In reality, Simon and Brookfield's piece, the actual retail operating company, OpCo, cost them just $800 million, $300 million in cash, $500 million in new debt they took on. The other $950 million wasn't really a purchase at all. JCPenney's own lenders agreed to forgive that much debt, in exchange for taking ownership of 160 real estate properties and every distribution center the company owned. Those lenders became landlords too, renting the buildings straight back to the retail operation under a master lease. Those lenders became landlords too, renting the buildings straight back to the retail operation under a master lease. Read that structure carefully, and the purpose becomes obvious. Nobody paid $1.75 billion for a struggling department store chain. They paid $800 million to keep a wounded tenant breathing and let its own lenders absorb the rest of the cost in the form of real estate they could still collect rent on either way. The zombie wasn't an accident. It was engineered on purpose by the people who needed it standing. Unlike most corporate collapse stories, this one doesn't need a theory about who benefited. It's on the record. Simon Brookfield are real estate companies first. Their value comes from the rent roll across their malls, not from how many pairs of jeans JCPenney sells. Keeping JCPenney storefronts lit, even at a loss, protects the value of every other lease in every mall JCPenney anchors. The store didn't need to turn a profit to be worth saving. It just needed to stay open. That's a real estate outcome dressed up as a retail turnaround story, which makes what happened next even harder to explain away as loyalty to the brand. In January 2025, JCPenney merged into a new joint venture called Catalyst Brands, folding in Brooks Brothers, Lucky Brand, Nautica, Aeropostale, and Eddie Bauer under one roof, backed by Simon Brookfield, Authentic Brands Group, and Shein. One parent company. 5.5 struggling American retail names under one umbrella. As of 2026, JCPenney is still operating roughly 643 stores. Meanwhile, Catalyst Brands is reportedly preparing to let a different one of its own brands, Eddie Bauer, walk into bankruptcy, with every North American location expected to close. Same parent company, same ownership group. Two brands in similar trouble, and two completely opposite decisions. One gets propped up with engineered financing, the other gets allowed to die. The difference was never which brand deserved to survive. JCPenney survived because 600+ of its stores are load-bearing walls in someone else's real estate portfolio. Eddie Bauer doesn't carry that same weight for the same landlords. One corpse was worth keeping upright, the other wasn't. Strip away the story everyone was told, and here's what actually happened. A company died in a Texas courtroom in 2020. Its own landlords quietly bought the parts of it that protected their real estate for less than half the number in every headline, and let their tenants' own lenders absorb the rest of the risk. What's walking around your local mall today isn't JCPenney recovering. It's a load-bearing wall wearing a familiar name, kept upright for exactly as long as it protects value that belongs to somebody else. The day it stops doing that job is the day this zombie stops getting fed. Eddie Bauer already found out what that day looks like. JCPenney's landlords just haven't decided it's JCPenney's turn yet. If you want to see how these systems really work, hit like and subscribe to Second Move.